Welcome to the TEFL Training Institute podcast, the bite-sized TEFL podcast for teachers, trainers, and managers. Hello everyone, welcome to the podcast today, and we've got our favorite guest.
Oh, Matt's not going to be pleased.
So
That's all right.
So we've got Dave Weller.
Hurrah!
Hey Dave,
Hello.
welcome again.
Welcome back again, Dave.
My pleasure.
So for this special edition, actually, maybe we can just talk about the story of how it happened. I think Dave and I can't remember, what was the thing? Was it difficult to write down what we knew about language learning, or it was...
Well, I was just wondering about a question because, one of my trainees had a question about second language acquisition. And after we chatted for a bit, the thought occurred to me, well, it's a very simple question, but with an incredibly difficult answer. What's the best way to learn a language? And so from there, you can go in a number of different ways, but there's no easy, concise answer to it. There's no equivalent to E equals MC squared.
So the challenge for today was that each of us had one bit of A4 paper to write down how people learn languages. Or what was... Your question was slightly different.
No, I think originally we phrased it as, if an English learner comes to you and they want to get from A2 to C1, what's the best way to do that?
So all of us basically, I think, have written down everything we know after master's degrees and probably about 40 years of combined experience onto 3 separate sheets of A4 paper.
This could be kind of humbling.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what we're just going to do is just turn them over and then just compare our notes over the next however long it takes and then see what the similarities are and what the differences are.
Because we've all been working in complete secrecy and haven't seen each other's work.
Well, that's true, actually. Yeah, I mean, I never speak to Dave and Tracy, you and that well.
Wow, my beautiful handwriting and drawing and everything. I think from this perspective, I'm probably going to beat both of you.
Is it a competition? I didn't know.
Well, Ross, I guess because it's kind of hard to visualize. Do you want to stick these up on a blog on your website, so if people do want to look at them, they can?
That's an awesome idea. Yeah. I don't know. Do you want to take turns in this, or should it be like a card game? We go 1, 2, 3, reveal, or...
It's probably good to take turns, I think.
All right.
Otherwise, we might all get distracted by everybody else's.
Okay.
Did you number yours? Idea 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? Because I numbered mine.
Yes.
I have my 6. Oh, sorry. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, 6.
6. Okay. Well, look. Let's look at your one first, since it's now on the table and is only obscured by a...
Sorry, I don't really know
plan.
why I number 1, 2, 3, and then 5. Not 1 of 6.
Well, we're English teachers, Tracy. We're not maths teachers.
Okay, all right.
Fine.
That shows everything, right? Why I end up teaching English instead of others.
Cool.
Okay, so do you want to talk us through it?
And my first one is imitate, because I remember maybe Ross and I had a kind of a small conversation the other day and talking about how little kids imitate either adults or people around them. What's the point you were mentioned?
This was
You
from
mentioned. Sorry, what's the
book-
point you mentioned?
Yeah, this is from a book about how, the origins of language. Can't remember the author, but I'll put a link to it on the website. And he was saying that there's a difference between imitating and maybe copying, I think. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was a distinction he made between chimpanzees and kids. So it was like a task, open this box, and an adult would demonstrate how to open the box, and they would put in some steps that were unnecessary, like tapping on the top of the box 3 times and then turning a handle to open it. And children would do what the adults did. They would include the unnecessary steps, but chimpanzees wouldn't. They would dispense with
really
those.
interesting. I would have guessed it would have been the other way around if you'd have asked me.
Absolutely. So he was saying in some ways you could say the chimpanzee's behavior is more intelligent than the children. But he was making the point that if you're learning a language as a child, right, for first language acquisition, there's no real advantage to learning it, right? It doesn't help you necessarily get any more food as a child. But he was almost saying kids' ability to, I can't remember what the word was, but basically imitate or copy or whatever it is that adults do for no reason right? Or maybe there is a reason, but we don't really know what it is, right? It's not like opening a box. It doesn't help you achieve a task necessarily, at least at the beginning. You're just copying what adults are doing. Helps you acquire the language, and that's something that animals, at least chimpanzees, are never willing to do. And I think he was sort of putting that forward as a reason why, humans are able to learn languages and chimpanzees don't.
Yeah, the reason why I put it as the first point, because I think back how I learned a language, because when of course, and I was in university already, and how many hours that I spent just try to imitate, like listen to the tape or back. I have to just repeat and then what the recorder said, and then just followed exactly what the recorder said, and then I can just record myself and listen to what I said. That I didn't think it was very useful back then, but after like maybe 1 or 2 years, I definitely realized it's helping, because when I had a conversation naturally with people, I think those utterances naturally came out.
Like the audiolingual method.
Yes, exactly. But it's quite interesting when I was trying to find out more research and information about imitation, especially for kids learning a language. Actually said imitation plays a very important role for phonological development. Yeah,
absolutely.
And
yes.
It's definitely like the people around them, and then what they hear, people, how they say, how they pronounce, and affect and how their original accent were developed.
I think they say that's one of the first sort of things that you lose, isn't it? Is the ability to sort of pick up an accent, like quote unquote like a native speaker, right? That's I think it's possible to sort of acquire the grammar of the language up until maybe you're 12 or 13 or something without much effort. But I think that pronunciation is something that...
Doesn't it start stopping at 9 months? You start to lose the ability to form distinct phonemes in a language that's not your own. And then from there it gradually gets worse and worse. Because at least from what I remember reading is every baby has the ability to pronounce any human language, but they gradually lose it the more they listen, the more input they have from their mother tongue.
Yeah, it's funny because you mentioned it being audiolingual, right? And that's something that seems to kind of gone out of fashion, but it also reminded me about how now I think a lot of companies are getting students to do that sort of like listen to this and then just repeat afterwards, and then we give you a mark for how good your pronunciation is.
Voice recognition, like
using that voice recognition technology, yes. And that seems to be something that's coming back into fashion again.
Well, it seems that every new method we have or approach we have or method of learning a language, there seems to be a reaction against the one that came previously, right? So you stop doing a lot of the things. People tend to cherry pick the good techniques or the good methods and then throw out the rest. But there actually is some value in things like repetition, translation. They all get bad reputations from past methods.
Good. Okay, so what's number 2, Trace?
And
number 3. Did you remember number 2?
Number 2 is motivation.
Ooh.
I presume you included that, did you, Dave?
No, it's not necessary at all, surely.
And it's quite funny, actually. I drew the little man on this because I thought I like drawing a...
He's got no hair, is that me?
Maybe. So I put swearing words because I was thinking, why there are a lot of people that are learning a new language, and then if you ask them, how you ask for price and how you ask for directions, I don't know how to say it, and they don't even know how to ask for toilet, right? But they can swear. It's just like the motivation. I'm so sorry, I'm not saying.
So you've got how do people learn languages, and then it says learning swearing words.
Well, no, I mean, to be fair, I still remember when I learned Spanish in school and French. We learned it in secondary school, and the first day the teacher gave us the dictionaries, of course, what did everybody do? Yeah. You immediately flip to the swear words.
We did that in English class as well. I mean, not just in French.
Yeah. So I know it's kind of like extremely example about motivation, but I do think people, if they are really interested to find out what they need to say and how they communicate in real life, and it's going to be more useful and they're more motivated. I remember when I was a student, even like I started working, I still try to improve my English, but I was thinking, I love to go to different markets and then shopping malls. So I think that's a great way for me to increase my vocabulary related to those areas. I turn to look at like the shopping catalogs in English version, and then I think it's really helpful because I know how to describe different kind of clothes, and it's really helpful for me when I'm teaching. Because we do have, this kind of general English and topic related to shopping, to clothes, and then especially ladies or young girls, and they would like to ask you something, hey, how would you describe this, right? And I would like to say that related to fashion or clothes. So I think that's really helpful. And
clothes for the girls and swearing for little boys, right? For topics.
Well, not really.
I can't wait to buy your course book.
And that's really why do people tend to learn those utterances first and then what they really need.
I remember in my first year in Xi'an, and we had a Chinese class, one of the few I've ever been to. And the teacher hadn't prepared. She just turned up and said, okay, what do you want to know? And there was one quite cantankerous lady who was desperate to continue her knitting habit.
Oh, no.
So she dominated the lesson, kept interrupting and steering the conversation back to learn how to say knitting paraphernalia, knitting needles, the verbs for knitting.
I mean, great in a one-to-one class.
Perfect.
Right? But in a group setting, maybe not so much, yeah. So, something else interesting that I read about this is that apparently students are able to read more difficult texts on topics that they are interested in and know a lot about, right? So you get two students of, maybe student A is a higher level than student B, but if you give them a text on football or something and student B is very interested in football, student B will actually be able to read and understand and answer comprehension questions on that text more than student A.
Those techniques like narrow reading or intensive reading rather than extensive reading where you focus narrowly on one subject, students tend to do that only when they're really interested, or students do it by themselves only when they're incredibly interested in one particular topic area. And so, it makes sense that their comprehension of that topic is way higher than their average.
Yeah.
You want to move on to number 3?
Because you talk about like a comprehension, and then this something that I read about Krashen's comprehensible input hypothesis. And on the other hand, Swan and the colleagues, I think they did research, and then which is not a comprehensible input, it's a comprehensible output hypothesis. I do believe we should actually develop like speaking and listening input and output, because you can receive some meaningful information and then you process it, and then you're trying to react in a meaningful way. The next one, I would say, I don't know if you guys wrote down, learn how to learn a language.
I did include that. Did you, Dave?
Mm-hmm. Ooh.
Well, Dave's still keeping his cards very close to his chest, isn't he? Even this far in.
Yeah, I think you guys can freak out.
Uh-oh. What's he got?
All right. And because I think for this area, we've talked about this, right? But still, at the moment, I don't really think there are a lot of either language organizations or schools or parents or even the whole industry or society really focus on that. Because I had a phone call last night with my niece. I asked her, how's your English? She said, not very good. And I said, why not? And then she said, there were too many new vocabulary compared to primary school, because she's year 1 in middle school.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, did your teacher give you some advice on how to improve English? Like, maybe there's some way you did not very effective? And she said, no, not really. I said, have you ever thought about it to think what you did and how you study language or even other subjects? And you can talk to your teacher. And she said, yeah, I kind of having my own plan. But still, I don't think she kind of realized how important the learning strategies, not only language learning, I think for all subjects learning.
It's interesting that seems to be pretty well documented, right? That it's really useful to learn how to learn, but it doesn't seem to be happening
anywhere.
And I wonder why that is. I mean, I think one or two things would seem to be, I think at least that make it especially different in English language learning is if you have a situation where either the teacher doesn't speak the same first language as the students, or the teacher, for whatever reason, isn't allowed to speak the first language of the students, that the students almost need to get to a very high level before you can explain to them, here are some strategies for how to learn. I think that's one thing. And then I wonder if another issue is that we kind of have a bit of an aversion maybe to just giving people stuff. I sometimes feel, I think communicative language teaching, we like helping students discover things so much and helping them be independent that we're a bit reticent to say, here's a great strategy for how you can learn, because it's like I don't want to lecture to them. I don't want to tell them. I want them to find their own best way.
See, that's the thing I always think of. I think teachers, before, when we were teacher-centered, or the profession was teacher-centered, we used to be the gateway to language, and students used to have to come to us. to be drip-fed certain language points. But now my concern, now we're student-centered, is that we're the gateway to learning techniques and learning strategies. Students have to come to us and we drip-feed the best way to learn in the right order, but we don't teach students to think for themselves. I even came across some research. They tracked when language learners gave up, and it seemed to be there was a high correlation from when learners lost clarity. Like they weren't sure the best way to progress forward because they didn't know which strategy to take. Because learning a language, as we all know, is such a long process, and there's so many moving parts: the lexis, grammar, phonology, listening, all the skills, the vocabulary, what to do when. It's a very dense process. Unlike something like maths, where you have a very clear way forward and a logical series of steps to follow, that can be quite linear. And
I think this podcast is a great example of how it's not linear, right? The fact that, like, you know, us writing out how you learn a language and getting completely different things on a page just shows how, and we've been doing this for a long time, how difficult it must be for students.
Sure, no, exactly. Well, going back, I can't even believe that I haven't tried to sit down and clarify it before in my 15 years in the industry. We've never sat down and gone, well, actually, how do we learn a language? What is the best way?
And interesting, you said to me earlier today, Tracy, you're like, oh, this is so great, right? Like, I've learned so much just from going through this process to write it out. So maybe an interesting point for teachers listening to this is why don't you make your own?
Of course, just continue this bit, how or who should be responsible for guiding the students to form the habit of analyzing their learning. There must be some tools which could be used for different age group students.
Yeah, things like mnemonics for young learners, or rhymes, or stories, or things like that. And just, I think this is a conversation in mainstream education as well. Like, it's quite a cause for concern that even in government-run schools, that you don't get taught how to learn. Things like how to improve your memory, like how to take notes effectively, good study habits. They're paid lip service to, 2 or 3 months before exam time, but by then everyone's cramming anyway. So I think this is especially relevant for us.
Okay, for myself, I remember when I prepared a training at the very beginning, I became a trainer. It probably took me a long time, but actually the result wasn't very good. And then after so many times, I realized this doesn't work for me. I prepared so long. The result is still not better than spending less time. So I changed the way how I prepare my training. I know if you give me 2 hours or 2 or 3 days and I spend the whole day planning one training, it's still not going to be much better than spending 2 or 3 hours. So but we are able to do that. I don't know, maybe because we're adults, or I'm not sure, because you think about it, because you were challenged.
Well, they say that's often the difference between the high-achieving students and the average or the low-achieving students is not necessarily the strategies that they use to begin with, but just the fact that they reflect on the strategies they use and how successful they've been, and then they alter their approach afterwards. But I guess maybe one thing that teachers can do is just say, doing that thing of, like, in a class, like, how did you take notes today, or how did you try to memorize these items of vocabulary? Did it work? And at least plant that seed of thinking about what was your technique and how effective was it, and I don't know, speak to your partner, how good was theirs?
Essentially, all these different ways are encouraging learner autonomy, and a big part of learner autonomy is that they know strategies for learning, right?
But there is almost that paradox there, isn't there? That, like, in order to encourage learner autonomy, you do have to be maybe quite teacher-centered and just lecture on, here's some 5 good strategies, right?
Precisely, yes.
Yeah. That's why I had to write everything down, like drawing pictures, because I'm a visual learner. Sorry, Dave. I have to. Anyway, just joking. 2 small ones, and one is like a learning conditions, because I do realize the people around the students, the schools and parents, the teachers, and even the whole society and the market, and how much that they influence and how the students learn and how well they can learn. And for example, like usually inside the classroom or outside the classroom, either parents or schools or maybe overlooked the error the students make. I observe a lot of classes, and we thought, okay, the kids actually did really well. There might be some small mistakes, and it's not really impeded the communication, and it wasn't really the main focus in the class. And then there are some other, primary mistakes, and then we should correct in the class. But the parents usually complain and they say, oh, the teacher didn't correct my kids' mistakes. You didn't do your job well. So it's kind of leading to the extreme scenario that the whole class always like a lot of correction. Then you can see the parents even like telling the teacher directly, oh, correct my kids more often. Of course, the teachers want to make sure the parents are happy, with their teaching. So they're trying to compromise, and even they're trying to explain, but not all the parents understand the reason why I didn't do it.
So is that a case to teach parents those learning strategies as well?
Exactly. I notice more and more in how little that we educate the parents and why we're doing in the class. That's why, and they're probably just listen to the salespeople, or they probably just listen to people who are not really professional or understand learning. You know what I mean? Just like something is actually not right. But because the population believe it, and then now it's kind of something real or true, and people start believing it. Oh, actually, that's right. Let's do that.
And I think that's a particular problem with education, because everyone pretty much has had an experience as a student, right? And everyone's learned a first language, and probably most people have even attempted to learn a second language at school. So everyone has an opinion on, oh, this is the best way, this is what teachers need to do, I know what works. But I thought it's so interesting that like people have those opinions, but people wouldn't say that about medicine, right? Or people wouldn't say that about like, I don't know, like fixing a car, because in general, not everyone in the population has those experiences, but with teaching, they do. And I think, like you say, that's such an important point of educating the parents. You kind of mentioned the sales staff, so educating them, other people in the school on what actually works. Because if you get all those people to buy into things that have been proven to work, how much easier would our jobs be? And how much better would that be for students as well?
Precisely, yeah. I totally agree.
I realize Dave's favorite word.
Precisely. It's the first time he said it this podcast. We should play.
No, the second time.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, precisely.
We should have played Precisely Bingo instead. How many minutes in?
You're pushing my buttons. Learning styles and precisely.
The last small thing I want to say is it's actually from you, Ross. Like your.
So Stephen Crash and Swain and me, right? Those are your references.
And because remember today I sent you a message, and you replied and said, "What are you talking about?" And I'm thinking, "What are you talking about? Why didn't you understand?" And then you told me you read the word recipe
as receipt.
And then he was really confused about what I was talking about.
Yeah, you asked for a gingerbread man recipe, and I thought you were saying, "Where's the gingerbread man receipt?" I thought, when did we buy a gingerbread man?
Yeah, because you mentioned maybe because when you were young and you realized you didn't really enjoy learning languages.
My spelling was terrible. Yeah, and I think I always saw my identity was I'm good at maths and science, and I'm not good at art subjects. Very, very bad at spelling. And so right the way through definitely secondary school and university, I dropped all those things: history, music, French, German. And ironically, those are all the things that I'm interested in now and do in my professional life. And those are also the things that I will read about in my spare time. Yeah, I think because those were things that I was not good at. I just didn't like doing them, or at least I did like doing the things that I was good at, which is maybe an argument for your growth mindset type thing. I think I was obviously praised a lot for the things that I was good at, the things I was able to get right. But obviously the downside of that is I dropped a lot of things that I wasn't so good at that, ended up being really interesting.
But that's not the point I wanted to say.
Well, at least I got to speak.
But what I wanted to say is we do sometimes ignore if this is a problematic student or it's the students with problem. Because I think during learning process, and then we realize, oh, this person or this kid or this learner is not really good at this, or naughty, or not very careful, or doesn't work very hard. But I don't think it's really, how can I say, a 100% demonstrate and how this person is or their learning ability is.
I think it's really a shame sometimes because I think teachers and people in positions of power for young learners have to be really careful with their words, because sometimes the things they say or the feedback they give, especially if it's negative, can be the words that the learners play to themselves in their heads. And sometimes if it's a private language school, you might only see learners in the evening or at the weekends when they're already tired from school. They can see on your face that you're frustrated with them, or they can start to get a very negative self-image, and I think we all have to be quite careful of that.
How many trainings or things have you guys ever had to read about students with, special learning needs or learning disabilities?
Not very.
What do you mean, sorry?
I can only think of once where I've been to a training that was like, here's how to help students learning English who have dyslexia. For example, I think that's 1 hour of all the professional development.
Yes, very, very.
Yeah, very little.
It seems to be something that's kind of missing, isn't it, a bit from teacher education?
Yeah, I think in mainstream education, you get a lot of support. Your special educational needs, the PGCE course, you get a lot of trainings which do help teachers address that and prepare for that in the classroom. And also there's generally a lot more support given in the classrooms in government schools. So our industry is unfortunately lacking in that regard, rather.
Good. All right. So Tracy, is that it? Are you done?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
That was really good, Trace. Thank you.
I thought this whole podcast was only going to last this long. We just got through your half or your third. It's like my disk drive is coming up. It's already full.
Should you have a little pause?
Yeah, let's do a pause. I'll save this. Are you ready? Are you paying attention?
Yes.
Okay. There we go. Here's mine.
Oh, look at that!
I started off with something very similar to what I presume you wrote, which is that your what's his name? Pitcorder, sorry. Of the two things that you need are motivation and input. And yeah, so what have I put about motivation? That their short-term motivation is important in terms of what you're reading and what you're doing in class has to be interesting on a class to class. If you're reading boring text and you're doing boring activities, it's really unlikely that you're going to keep up with your study. But obviously this road to learning is really long, and it's also important to have some long-term motivation for students to see their improvement and everything. The example I like to give for this is when I used to go to the gym and I think this is a gym thing that people do, is that they'll measure like how much weight you can lift. And this gym I used to go to, they did this every 2 or 3 months, and they'd record your maximum lifts and then just show you, well, this is now how much you can lift. And I thought that was such a nice, tangible way of making you aware of your progress.
That's the thing, it's quite tough to do that in language learning, though, isn't it? Because the kind of metrics that you'd measure are quite arbitrary. People tend to be naturally incentivized to go after improving their numbers. So if it was amount of words you knew, for example, you go after that, and maybe to the detriment of your fluency, for example, or actually being able to use them appropriately.
So I also put some things next to this about it's about achieving your goals, and then I put what's a good goal? Being a native speaker, sounding like a native speaker is probably not a very useful goal for people. And then I put some notes about what demotivates people. Another Stephen Krashen thing, effective filter. That, if you're having a bad experience, you feel stressed out, and that barrier goes up and probably stops you learning. Boring activities, focusing too much on the form of the language rather than the content is probably bad. Not giving people a reason to learn. I mean, at least this was for me at French at school, and I've heard other people say this as well. Like, why am I learning this? I used to think like, I'm never going to go to France. That seems so far away, which is obviously quite ironic now, right? And then a final thing is backwash from exams. Another thing that I think stops people from being motivated, or at least stopping people maybe from learning things that are useful, in that, I've got to do this multiple choice grammar exam in 2 years' time, so that's what I'm going to focus on. Did you have or you're still holding your card close to your chest?
No, I did have motivation in there.
Big differences or things you disagree with in there?
Mine's a little bit different, I think.
Oh my god, I can't wait to see what it is. It's just going to be a drawing or something, or it's an interpretive dance.
How did you guess?
So that was motivation, and then the other half, input. So what did I have here? It was so long ago that I wrote this. See, this is the downside.
When did you write it?
Well, I think it was about at least 2 weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago. This is a problem with being organised. People that just did their homework on the day of, it's all still in the short-term memory, whereas
Ross is looking at Tracy and me with a piercing gaze.
Yeah. It's like, I don't remember writing this. So what have I got? Input, I've put obviously listening and reading, and I've put about reading like intensive reading, extensive reading, shared reading. There's lots of studies, book flood studies and things that show that those have great results. There's a Mungabai and Ellie study from Fiji where they basically gave students, I think they had like 3 conditions. They gave some students books and just said go and read them. Other teachers, they sort of trained them on doing shared reading, and then other teachers were just doing audiolingual classes. And the students that had the best results were the ones that were reading books with a teacher. Did much better than the students who were doing audiolingual classes. The same with the Lightbound and Spada study. I think it's Lightbound and Spada anyway, of being in, I think it's Montreal, Canada maybe, and they've got students in audiolingual classes, and then the other students are just listening and reading. And then after a couple of years, the students who are just listening and reading show as much or more progress than the students who are actually in teacher-fronted classes. So I think for me that's kind of the interesting point there about input, is that it can be incredibly effective. Having said that, I think most of those studies that I've seen on that seem to be from the, I'm going to say, early to mid-80s. And they seem to be comparing reading or lots of comprehensible input with audiolingual classes, which I think, well, I mean, maybe you could compare audiolingual classes with nothing at all, and then the audiolingual would still come out second, right? You're using maybe a bit of a discredited approach or method there. I think that's something that maybe is still a bit of an unresolved question. I think also here somewhere I must have something, but about how there is a limit to what comprehensible input can achieve. Maybe I'm skipping ahead here, but I'm pretty sure that at some point students need some focus on forms, and there seem to be some forms that are not salient enough, they're not obvious enough, that unless you explicitly teach them, then unless you're in lessons from now until, or unless you're getting comprehensible input from now until infinity, you will never pick up on some of those forms. And the same with like error correction, that can actually help.
And so that would be what people say is the main difference between first language acquisition and second language acquisition, right? After you reach a certain age, to learn as an adult, to acquire a second language, you do need at some point to, we talked about Krashen already, but that's his monitor hypothesis, isn't it?
Yeah.
So that once you know the form, you're able to monitor your own output and hear, in the most part, when you do make an error.
So interesting, I got to this point and I'd assumed originally, you can probably see this from my drawing here, that I thought I would be able to group everything around motivation and input, but I found that I couldn't, and that there were some things that I knew or I know are important, and research has shown that you need in language learning that do not fit into those two categories. So one of them was the learning to learn from earlier, so teaching strategies, reflecting on what you've used, practice, so things like memory curves, the fact that like if you're getting input then it has to be recycled, and if it's not recycled then you'll forget it.
Like the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve.
Right.
Yeah.
Did you want to explain that for a minute? Because I think you're more familiar with that than I am.
Oh, well, that's just the idea, if you've heard of spaced repetition or distributed learning, that the first time you encounter something new, you'll remember it after a set amount of time. Back in the late 1800s, I think it's Hermann Ebbinghaus, made up a series of fake words, and with extreme dedication set about memorizing them. And then he timed himself how long it would be till he forgot those words. And then he did it a first exposure and then a second exposure a certain amount of time later, recorded those results and came up with a curve of how long it takes to forget, which apparently still holds fairly true today. I think it was repeated back in the 1960s, and it forms the basis of all the algorithms you have in all the spaced repetition software, like with flashcards, apps and so on.
Yes, so I had that in there, and then is there not something also about that I think is pretty well accepted that maybe related to that's maybe students need to come across a word, I think it's between about 7 times and 13 times or something before you remember it. I see those points as kind of connected. And I also had something here related to context, which was this idea, I think it's called transfer appropriate learning. So the idea that because you can learn something or use something in one situation does not mean that you'll be able to use the same thing in another situation. The example I often give for this is like me being, I think, fairly, I don't know, I'd say I was upper intermediate in Chinese in certain situations a few years ago, at least in social situations, let me say that, and then going to work in a Chinese company and finding I couldn't understand what was going on at all. I couldn't hold a meeting. I was pretty much hopeless.
And even for first language, I feel it's challenging.
Of course, yeah. You have your own area of expertise with things you know about and things you don't know about.
Exactly,
language,
yeah.
Right?
But as a flip side to that, I also put that, again, it relates back to those memory curves and distributed practice, that you can use flashcards like your man, what was his name again? Bob McMemory Curve.
No, if I say Ebbinghaus again, that's
Ebbinghaus,
3 times.
Thank you.
We'll
Did
get
he say
7.
precisely more or Ebbinghaus more?
Equally.
That using flashcards can be useful, even though that's decontextualized learning, that some of that can be used as long as you have opportunities to use that language in contextualized situations. Some other interesting things about input, maybe, that...
Is it a year?
It's meant to be an ear. Yeah. I actually looked up how to draw an ear online, and then...
Really?
And then you gave up and wrote listening on it.
It came out
So we
looking
get it.
really bad. Yeah. That, yeah, as well as being interesting, you don't always need the input to be in lexical sets. There seem to be some disadvantages, as well as maybe some advantages, but at least in terms of students maybe mixing up words, of teaching, similar words together at the same time. Like, for example, teaching apple and orange, or learning apple and orange, since we're doing it from the learner's point of view, is a bad idea, because you're very likely to get those words mixed up.
There's good evidence that interference will occur and the learners will struggle to recall the right one.
Yeah.
So that's why if you tell a story, for example, with various things embedded, like colours and animals, it's far more likely to stick.
Absolutely, very, very good point. But interesting as well that that's not really what happens, I think, in most language classes. And I don't think I ever did that as a teacher. I think I pretty much always taught things, now we're going to learn about animals, now we're going to learn about fruits, now we're going to learn about colours. So I think that's one of the nice advantages maybe of using interesting text to teach English, is that you can pull out maybe unrelated, or not entirely unrelated, but certainly words that are not all in the same lexical set, that are easily confused with each other, and then also from using those that you automatically get that distributed practice, because common words will appear across texts at the same level over many classes.
That's really interesting, because I think it's definitely useful for a material developer.
Well, it goes
That's
back.
interesting. Yeah.
It goes back to motivation again, doesn't it? Because we're wired to enjoy stories and find them interesting, and stories are inherently motivating because you want to know what happens in the end. It makes sense that we would remember them for longer, be more engaged by them, and have higher recall, and so embedding the lexis in those stories makes a lot more sense than teaching decontextualized set.
It's really interesting. Now I just look back to those lesson plans and during the teacher training courses, and then I realize, how often the vocabulary or the lexis that you put together they want to teach are all kind of like all related to one, not topic, one big category, right? And if you realize there are some words are not really related, we're probably just think, why are we teaching random words? They're not related. But you're right. I think because they're the key words in the story, in the text, it doesn't matter if they're really in the same category or not, but they're vital for understanding the story. And that's the target language, and that's something meaningful for the students.
Exactly. I remember teaching from a course book years ago when I first started, and each chapter was, again, taught a lexical set, it taught like a grammar point. Then at the very end of it, the final page was a story you could rip out and fold. And it was with very young learners, sort of 4 or 5 years old. And then you could all sit around in a circle, cross-legged, and get ready, and you bring in some realia to play with, and then you'd all sit down and kind of follow the words and read. And that was by far the most interesting and exciting part of any of the previous 3 lessons, because 3 lessons per unit. And so I started doing that at the very beginning instead. And I found that one simple change from moving the story from the end, which was summarising everything, to the beginning to set the context and raise motivation, just made a huge difference for the learners.
I feel that's another one of those points. Yeah, like you might get some pushback from parents and things if you're like, we're just going to do a whole course and we're just going to use storybooks, and that's the sort of thing people go, whoa, that's crazy, but probably might actually work.
I remember I did a parents, again I had some pushback when I was the DOS of a school many years ago, and parents about one particular class didn't understand why we were doing. They just wanted the teachers to follow the course book, teach the sets. They were counting the number of vocabulary students learned every lesson. They would just by the numbers. So I brought them in and gave them a lesson. And I said, look, okay, we're going to teach the way you want me to teach, and try to teach them, okay, repeat after me, and I did that. And okay, this is it. And I said, okay, now, this is how I'd like to teach. Come here. Here it is. And I kind of went and did the story with them. And again, they found it really, I wanted to know what happened. And they're all like leaning forward, like hooked. I was like, we're going to stop there. Like, no, we want to know the end of the story. and again, so this is, and see which one you remember better after a few days. And that one very graphic demonstration of how the classroom would work in the traditional way and in a more engaging, contextualized way sold them. Often people don't realise until they've seen it with their own eyes or experienced it, just how engaging and useful these techniques can be.
And then maybe the last couple of things I got about input, probably the most important ones actually, that obviously needs to be graded. That seems to be one of the biggest advantages of going to a language class, is that you're paying someone basically to grade their language to I+1, right, a level just above what you can understand. And that hopefully what you're listening to, maybe this is a bit of a paradox, but it also needs to be authentic-ish. That needs to be similar at least to what people are saying in the real world. And I realise that there's some tension between that and having something graded, but I think both of those are important. I also wrote a bunch of things about phonics and scanning and subskills and things, but I've forgotten what that was since it was so long ago. So maybe we can just go onto yours, Dave. But Dave, now we've only got 2 minutes left, so
Oh, brilliant.
do this really quickly.
That takes a whole lot of pressure off. Well, before I show you mine, I'd like to preface with, go back to something you said, Ross, about being really hard to categorise everything and fit it onto one page. So I went a bit nuts. Hold on, where's my paper? Over here. And I did this.
What's that? A0, Dave, is it?
Wow.
Oh my god.
So it looks a bit strange, but bear with me. Everything you said, I've got a lot of what you both said is included in here.
Sorry, I feel I need to describe this to the listeners because it's a bit of a visual thing. Dave showed us a colour-coded table with some numbers which at first glance didn't seem related to anything. But I'm sure are, so please listen on.
Well, I'm sure they haven't switched off by now. No, so everything that both of you mentioned, when I started to think about it, I was trying to categorise it into different aspects, and at first I thought, well, as Tracy, you mentioned the different skills, right? Listening, speaking, reading, writing. Then I realised that couldn't account for everything. Then Ross, you mentioned things like distributed practice and memory curves and interleave practice, and I thought, yeah, they are also equally good, but how do they fit together? And then I thought, well, maybe the language. So I looked at the major levels of linguistics, and then I looked at the actual activities that people do that we've mentioned as well. So I was really struggling to put all this together in my head before I put it down on paper. And then I remembered something that Richards and Rogers did, the way they described approaches and methods in language learning. And they divided it into 3 levels. They divided it into approach, method, and technique. Approach being the overarching theoretical side, things like communicative language teaching or grammar translation. The method being engage, study, activate, or test, teach, test, the actual way you'd structure the lesson. And finally, the technique, which is the specific actions that the teacher would use in class. With that in mind, I then realised you could do that with learning. So I've come up with something which I call principle, aspect, and activity. And again, the principle is the theory, the aspect is the skill of language or the language learning, and then the activity is the action that you would take as a learner to learn. And then I've got an extra column with tools and materials which would support that activity.
Wow.
So
it's not been a busy week at work, has it, for you, Dave?
Well, no. Once I get a bee in my bonnet, it just wouldn't let go, and so I just kept thinking and reading. I probably read about 4 or 5 books, or reread a few of them as well.
Wow, that's more books than I've ever read.
So,
do you want to start off with the principles?
I think it's probably the easiest entry into it. So, for the principles, whenever you read a second language acquisition text, the only reference is information and data that's been done in our industry. From my readings anyway, it doesn't seem to take into account any advances in neuroscience, any advances or ideas from cognitive psychology, or even any ideas from the polyglots around the world who seem to learn huge numbers of languages with ease. So those are the 4 things I referenced to come up with the principles. So I came up with 6 theories and sort of fairly well-established evidence-based ones from cognitive psychology, a lot of which you've mentioned already. So that would be things like interleaving, where you study one thing then another so you don't get bored, and retrieval practice, so you come back and try and recall what you've learned, space practice, which we mentioned with Ebbinghaus, dual coding, so you kind of might listen and read at the same time to reinforce those connections in the brain, and using concrete examples. Then from neuroscience, I took from people like Dan Willingham and his latest book, and those are things like knowledge precedes skill. Also, he has a lovely phrase which is memory is the residue of thought. So you need to think about something before you can then create a memory. So be careful what you encourage your students to think about.
Just by the way, I can't believe I didn't put that on my sheet, this thing of like deep processing, higher level cognition, that the more you get students to think, the more that they will remember, and that you really want to get people to cognitively work hard if you want them to remember what you've taught.
So that's where things like task-based learning would really enter into it, because you're forcing the students to think to solve a problem which they're engaged and motivated to do. And then from second language acquisition is probably more familiar. Things like balancing the four skills, extensive and intensive input and output, as you mentioned, Tracy, as well. Learn high frequency first. Motivation, meta-learning, which you mentioned. Practice having short-term goals, which you mentioned as well, Ross. So all these things are quite standard in the SLA texts. And then from the polyglots as well, did a range from some of the famous polyglots of old to some of the more modern ones, but they mentioned things which I didn't seem to find anywhere else, like things like immersion. A lot of mention from the old times, either surrounding yourself with a language, just reading books in that language, or in the modern day we have the ability to, as I've noticed you do, Ross, you turn your laptop so it's all in Chinese.
Oh, that's not deliberate, I just haven't figured out how to turn it into English yet.
Well, that's good motivation for you to learn how to do so, I guess.
Absolutely.
And then some polyglots say you have to find the right method for you. It's about personalization. Some are saying quality before quantity. One polyglot that talks about the Kernel method of learning language. It was quite controversial when he first came out with it, but he asserted that if you knew 300 words intimately, maybe you only knew the base form or the basic word in an active way, but you could passively recognize the associations and collocations and when they were using idioms or what have you, that you could get up to C1 level in a language just by knowing 300 words in a language. Obviously that was highly contested. Some people said maybe 1,000 words or what have you, but you can see...
Same principle, right?
Same quality, but again, the principle is quality before quantity. Those would be the principles of the theories that I would like to base the skills and the aspects on.
That's awesome.
So then the middle level of learning I've called aspect, either skill or aspect, I'm not sure which to call it, but this would be where you have listening, reading, speaking, writing, those skills, but also the other variables like input and output, accuracy, fluency, maybe even meaning and form. And initially I put these in a table with the listening, speaking, reading, writing across the top, and then those other variables down the side, and from that you can create the third level, which is the actual action the learner engages in, the activity they are doing to practice those mid-level aspects.
Now I see where the numbers come in.
So the numbers, it looks a bit strange, but I started to do it with lines where I was drawing everything together, and it turned into a mess very quickly. So the aspects I labelled listening, reading, speaking, writing, 1, 2, 3, 4. But the other aspects like memory, input, output, accuracy, fluency, there's A, B, C, D, E. From the aspects like 1A or 2B, it can relate up to the theoretical principles. And likewise, they linked down as well to the activity. So an activity might be labelled 2E, which is reading for fluency. Every activity I could think of could be categorised in this way by the skill it's practicing, one of the four, and then by the language learning aspect that it's practicing. So that would be accuracy or fluency, meaning or form, input or output, or it might be memory specific. Any activity that you can name could fit into that. And so that way...
Which one is Hangman?
Sticky ball on the whiteboard.
Sticky ball was missing from that list as well.
No.
You always miss something I do.
I feel like, in Blackadder where Dr. Johnson's compiling the dictionary. So he's got every word in the English language.
Here it is, sir. The very cornerstone of English scholarship. This book, sir, contains every word in our beloved language.
Every single one, sir?
Every single word, sir.
Oh, well, in that case, sir, I hope you will not object if I also offer the doctor my most enthusiastic contrafibularities. Contrafibularities, sir? It is a common word down our way. Oh, I'm sorry, sir. I'm anaspeptic, phrasmotic. even compunctious to have caused you such pericombobulation.
And then the final one is just tools, materials that you could use. Again, I didn't have time, but you could relate those to the different activities as well.
You've got role play as an example of an activity. It's obviously something that you've got there as a speaking and fluency or speaking and output, but that could also be listening, right, as well, couldn't it? If you're doing a role play, or it could be you could be focused on accuracy if it was like a role play of a surgeon doing brain surgery on someone, right? Or it could be fluency, or it could be anything. There's
a lot of crossover here as well, and it's a lot of grey areas, so things aren't exactly that precise. As you say, you can adapt activities to focus on other things. I like the idea of dividing it into 3 levels as a model for learning, because that way everything I could think of, it would fell into one of these 3. And also I like the idea of also updating the information we have available to the people in our industry, so when they look at how we learn, they don't just reference the SLA text, they also reference evidence-based strategies from neuroscience, from cognitive psychology, and from huge vast experience of modern polyglots rather.
Yeah. I'm just realising that for people listening to this, we've not actually referred to many activities beyond Hangman. So do you want to pick...
Hangman isn't actually on there as well, I should say.
do you want to pick like 1 or 2, Dave, and maybe talk about a couple of favourites of activities that you think really learn?
Sure.
And maybe also do the same for the tools and materials.
Sure. So there's someone that we mentioned already, like narrow reading, where you're reading in a specific genre or context. Or if you're incredibly enthusiastic about football, you might be reading the footy news about who's injured, who's not. You have flashcards or spaced repetition software for learning either individual words or chunks, phrases, perhaps. You could have repeated listening or reading, role plays, spelling practice, transcription, as you mentioned earlier, Tracy was on there. All these are kind of classic strip bare that have a very specific purpose.
What about tools and materials? You want to?
Yeah, so something on there which you mentioned, Ross, is graded readers, but it's got things like lyrics and songs, podcasts, pronunciation dictionaries, spaced repetition software, visual dictionaries, translation apps. But we have so much choice these days. We mentioned it about teachers being the gateway to meta learning. But I think if students know the strategies for learning, the materials are out there. It often seems very daunting. It's something, when I started learning Chinese, you think, where on earth am I going to find material at my level? And you just can't find it unless you go to a teacher and they give you a course book saying this is your level. Whereas if you start searching the internet, there's so much on there. It's like drinking from a fire hose. You just don't know where to look or where to find it.
It's almost that problem of having too much choice, isn't it?
Exactly, yes. And so if you are able to know the learning strategy, but then it's also, as you mentioned, pick order much earlier, it's about access to data. I think in this day and age, it's not just access to data, it's access to the graded or the correct data. And there's so much out there now. We have the opposite problem that Pitt Corder did back in the 60s, where he had a few dictionaries and maybe the odd authentic newspaper to reference. We have so much on the internet that it's hard to find it at our level.
Couple of questions to wrap up. What do you most wish that you'd put on your list? That if you could steal 1 point from someone else's list, what would it be?
I think from Tracy's, I would steal imitation. Something I didn't put down on here, one of the activities, but I meant to, was shadowing. I really like that, where somebody, or you're listening to song lyrics or you're watching TV and you repeat after them as fast as, at their speed, but just a second or so behind, as fast as you can, to practice your fluency and to get your mouth used to using the muscles in the correct way. I think that's a very underutilized skill, and I think that's a natural extension of what you said earlier, Tracy. So I think that from first language acquisition, we could take a lot of techniques. Yeah. I mean, there's a great sort of semi-corpus that I've just discovered. It's quite old, so I'm probably behind the times, but it's called, I think, playphrase.me, and you type in a chunk, a language chunk, like it's all about, or what about, and it immediately pulls up endless clips from YouTube that play the video with people saying what about, so you can see it in all different, and it has the words before and after.
Wow. So it's like a video corpus.
It's a visual video audio corpus.
Wow, that's so cool.
I've been playing with it a lot recently. It's pretty impressive.
Of course, I think first would love to have the 3 levels and to look at and how we learn the language. And I think one thing particular is the principle. And you're talking about neuroscience. I know that's something you're particularly interested in. And for both of you, I think because you two kind of influenced me as well, I think that's definitely something I'm trying to read or listen more, recent a couple of years, and try to understand how our brain works and how this kind of affect our learning.
Cool. Well, I was going to wait to see who was the person who hadn't had something picked from their list and then picked from theirs to be polite, but that person was me that no one picked from, so I'll pick something that wasn't from either of you, which is...
I was just about to pick something from yours.
Yeah.
You spoiled it now.
Too late. Which is using your L1 to help you learn your L2. So using things like translation, visualization. I think as you mentioned before, Dave, earlier, we are often very hesitant maybe to use translation in class because grammar translation has got such a bad method. We've spoken on the podcast before about how teachers don't like using L1 in the classroom, and yet it can be a really great tool. So, okay, final question. What books or resources or whatever would you recommend them to go to? Because I know, Dave, I can see you've got your references on there. Like, what authors would you recommend? What authors would you recommend people to check out?
Well, recently I finished Dan Willingham's book called Why Students Don't Like School. I think it's a very easy introduction to neuroscience, and each chapter is about one particular point. I think it's very accessible, very well written, and I'd, if I could pick one book off that list, I'd recommend that.
I really recommend that book I mentioned to you, Dave, before, like Teach Your Child How to Think. That's from...
De Bono.
Yeah, De Bono. Yeah, I think that's... I don't know, there's a lot of things I've ever thought about before, and really there are a lot of practical activities that you can do at home to help your child, or help the students, of course, in school, and then make sure that you can help them to increase like their thinking ability, which is also related to the learner autonomy, and then learn how to learn. That's all connected.
Good
What
point.
about you, Ross?
Well, maybe a couple of authors first. So Paul Nation, I think, is awesome and has written relatively recently lots of books that I think are relatively easy to read. I think Brian Tomlinson as well, a few of the ideas that I mentioned here are stolen directly from him, especially things about
I
using
reference
interested
Nation
tools.
a lot as well. So.
Yeah, the thing I'm reading at the moment that I would recommend to people is Linguistics and Second Language Acquisition by Vivian Cook. Again, it's a relatively easy read. And if you want a really, really easy read, this is a recommendation that you gave to me, Dave. Something called Make It Stick, which is sort of like a pop science book, but it's about how you learn, and very easy to read and also very interesting.
Oh, and also there's another great podcast. Sorry, am I allowed to mention the podcast?
No, it's all right. I'll cut this bit out.
The Learning Scientist podcast. It's got about 4 or 5 ladies, all PhD doctorates, cognitive psychologists. So that's really easy way to get started.
Is a PhD doctorate the level above a PhD? Or? Well, Dave, thank you for joining us for what I guess is the longest podcast, just about longest podcast ever.
Hurrah!
Hurrah again. And everyone,
Thanks for listening.
hope you enjoyed it, and thanks a lot for listening.
All right, see you next time.
Goodbye.
Bye.
more podcasts, videos, and blogs, visit our website www.TEFLtraininginstitute.com.
If you've got a question or a topic you'd like us to discuss, leave us a comment.
And if you want to keep up to date with our latest content, add us on WeChat at TEFL Training Institute.
And if you enjoy our podcast, please rate us on iTunes.